have said this to very powerful people who thought I was being pretty impolite. So, your kids are going to be ashamed of you. They're not now. And miraculously, even though climate change has been going on for a long time, you still have the opportunity to be a leader.
Welcome to Good Citizen, a podcast from the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. I'm Ted Roosevelt. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Spencer Glendon. Spencer had a very successful career in finance, but came to realize that the markets and our society were thinking about climate all wrong. Through his work with Probable Futures, he has become one of the most influential advisors to executives around the world on how to think about climate risk for their businesses, cities, and organizations. Today, you'll get an inside look at what he is talking to those people about. From scientific insights to economic perspectives and personal reflections, I invite you to dive into this thought-provoking conversation with Spencer Glendon. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is a real pleasure for me to have you on this podcast.
Well, thanks. It's a treat to see you again and to see what we talk about.
Spencer, I've known you for the past decade or so, and you've largely been out of the public eye, and yet you talk to some of the most influential people in the world about climate change and how they should think about climate change for their businesses, for policies. And you've had a very outsized impact relative to your public profile. And I'd like to start there because you started an organization called Probable Futures. And I'd be really interested in understanding how that came to be and what its objectives are.
Sure. It's interesting to hear you explain it that way, all of which is true, and all of which is a deliberate choice. I worked for a long time in finance, where my work was about trying to understand how people's investment models would potentially go wrong. And I discovered, out of curiosity, that climate models were much better than any model I'd ever experienced at work. That actually for 40 years, climate scientists had been running these models that accurately predicted what was already happening. And what they foretold was really different than anybody was anticipating, especially myself. And so I came to the realization that climate change was likely to be far bigger a deal, if you will, than I anticipated. And I was somebody who had the luxury of looking around the world and wondering what the future would be like. Well, most people don't have that luxury. So if someone who had the luxuries that I had to be sort of scanning the horizon all the time for things that were coming had inadequately understood climate change, that was going to be a real problem for society. And when I looked around, what I saw was all the people I worked with were ignoring it actively, and their models didn't include it. It was like, well, maybe this provides insight into the kinds of questions I'm interested in about poverty or about prosperity or about investment or something. And then I just heard, no, actually, a stable climate is why all the things I care about exist. Like every single one of the things I care about exists because the climate was docile, was predictable. And there's a term in finance, low volatility or no volatility. If something is not volatile, if something doesn't change, you just stop looking at it. You stop paying attention to it. And so I've come to sort of forgive myself, if you will, for being so willfully ignorant. And so I asked myself, well, what can I do to ameliorate this problem? What can I do to help? And there were sort of two things I could do to help, was my assessment. One was I could collaborate with scientists and use some of the money that my wife and I were very fortunate to have to make public how good these models were, basically give anybody access to the insights of climate change. And then the second was, how can I influence decision makers? Because I had been in a position of real privilege in finance, because I'd had a track record of bringing good ideas to other people in other settings, I had relationships with chief investment officers of big pension funds around the world, with investors at a variety of different kinds of institutions. So the CFO of one of the biggest institutions in the world, literally called me and said, apparently I'm supposed to talk to you, with this sort of grumpy voice. And that has happened now many times in different ways. And my terms with all these people is that I work now entirely pro bono, and I will help institutions and individuals who have influence in the world on the condition that the work we do together be shared publicly with a large community.
So I want to punctuate this for a second because you walked away from an extremely successful career in finance. You were the director of research at Wellington, which is a capstone to an otherwise very successful career in finance. And you decided to dedicate your time, your energy, your personal finances to working with industry executives on a pro bono basis to help them plan for a better future for all of us. That's deeply inspiring.
Well, it's very kind of you to put it that way. And I've been sick most of my life in one way or another. So I was first ill in my teens with one disease. I have acquired another disease in my 20s or 30s, and in my 40s had a liver transplant. And all of those experiences did two things for me. One was help me understand risk better, not take a lot of things for granted. The other was treat my career as something that had a limited horizon. I just didn't know how long ahead. And so I had to leave to do something that I thought could have more power, more influence. It felt appropriate for me to take risks. I had so much good fortune. But also, I needed to try to figure out where were people able to actually make big decisions, because it wasn't in benchmark relative investing. It had to be somewhere else. And that's been my quest, is to find people who are making decisions that don't feel constrained by backward-looking expectations.
You talked about some health challenges and some good fortune. And those are two things that might lead you directly away from climate change. Those are both things that, I think a lot of people might run into and they're like, hey, it's not going to be my problem maybe, and I'm doing pretty well. And
well, I mean, I am talking to Ted Roosevelt, so talking about civic responsibility would be, I'd be remiss if I didn't. I grew up in a very civic household. I grew up with the expectation that you participate in the community you're in. I grew up in a household where if you see a problem, you say, well, what can I do about that problem?
Mm.
And I actually entered finance because of that. I thought this is an area where a lot of good things could happen. It's forward-looking. It deals in risks. But it wasn't a place where a lot of other people said, well, what I'd like to do is shape the world. They'd like to be associated with good things. And I don't blame them. Life's complicated. It's hard. It's hard to do these jobs. But it wasn't satisfying for me, and it didn't feel appropriately civic.
So how do you engage people? I mean, there are people who understand the perils of climate change, but don't want to try to shape the world, as you put it. And there are people who will say, listen, this is nothing new. Maybe it's caused by humans, but we've seen different temperatures before.
Depends what you mean by we and see. So we've seen these things. You got to go a long ways back for us to have seen this. So what I try to impress upon people, what changed my view of life, was realizing that the climate was very stable for 12,000 years within a 1 degree C band. And that happens to coincide perfectly with when we've had civilization.
Mm-hmm.
So people have been around for a couple 100,000 years at least. People just like us, minus the microphones and the headsets, just like us. And for the first 190,000 years, they did not settle. They kept moving. And if you look at the history of temperature, you can see that that was rational, because nice places didn't stay nice. Weather moved by latitude quite a lot because the average climate of the Earth was moving a lot. And then about 9,500 BCE, it stabilized at this very comfortable temperature for humans. And people noticed after a while, you know what? Seems like we don't need to move anymore. seems like the species we live with, the figs, the olives, the water buffalo, the birds that we like to be around are staying here. We can stay too. And people say, oh, I don't know. I've heard about all the, seems like the climate changed a lot in the Middle Ages and stuff. No, there were regional changes. They were within a degree. And we know this because the same species of trees have lived in the same places forever. People have been growing grapes in the same places for thousands of years, growing rice in the same places for thousands of years. And only now do those things not prosper there. So only now do the plants that lived in very specific places really no longer live in those places. So if you take California, or all these microclimates where these very long-lived trees lived, and many of them, those trees are what are known in some of the literature as zombie trees, which is they can still live there, but no new trees of that species will grow there because it is no longer the right climate for them. And so many of the places where we're having these big fires, it's not because it's a drought, it's because the climate is more arid. They're the wrong species. These are forests turning into grasslands naturally. Can we adapt? Yes, there are lots and lots and lots of things we can do. What I'm interested in the question you ask is the people who most often say that to me have no plans of adapting themselves. They say, we've adapted all the time. And I say, so fine, how are you adapting? They're like, oh, I'm not adapting, but we are adapting somehow.
Now, the climate science has been out there for a while, but figuring out how to translate that climate science in a way that is impactful seems to be a big part of the linchpin for you. How did you figure out where to focus your time and energy?
It's a great question, and it's still an ongoing process. So we'll take the case of an executive in a large institution. Why would I help them? Well, in every case that I've offered to help them, it's because they have come to a point where they actually need to make a decision about something. They're at a juncture where they actually are asking for help. And so that's a much easier place to help people is when they've already signaled they're not sure what to do. Mm. The other is then to go out, and this developed a third strain of work that I now have, which is actually publishing and speaking publicly and being in conferences and things, and basically making people uneasy. I'll give an example. The JP Morgan Investment Bank invited my colleague Alison and me to speak to a conference that they hosted of 70 real estate CEOs in Deer Valley, Utah, during the Sundance Film Festival. Now, they've invited these 70 people for a conference that's, explicitly, you're going to learn something, but boy, it's going to be nice. Bring your spouse, go see movies, ski. Like, the CEOs of these real estate companies did not say, what I want to do is learn about climate change. But they're trapped in a room, and they're there with their spouses, which is part of why we accepted the gig. And we explained to them, I asked them all before we get started, how many of you are using climate science in your work? And no one raises their hand. And I said, how many of you have a climate model that you use to make decisions? And nobody raised their hand. I said, well, you're all wrong. You're all using a climate model to make decisions. You're just assuming it's never going to change. If you have put something, a building, anything on, and these are all real estate CEOs, next to a river, on the ocean, on a mountain, you have made it in Deer Valley. You own a ski lodge. You've made an assumption about the future weather, and you don't know it. You've just made it based on history and instinct, patterns that you assume will persist. So actually, if you are not using climate science, you're just using a really specific, obsolete model. And some people get that and others don't. And when they get it, they're like, oh, this is why I can't get insurance, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. Because someone else is using a model, is updating their information, is looking forward, and you are not. You are now behind by not incorporating a reality for you. So that's sort of, you asked about the, linchpin. How do I unlock getting people interested? Mm-hmm. that's the other way to do it, is say you are now behaving, you're operating in society as if you know, and you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We've organized society in a way that doesn't actually leave much scope for risk management in most jobs. And that's been one of the most brutal discoveries for me in my career, is how limited, especially in the US, risk really isn't a discipline most people want to engage in. I grew up around Detroit, where the world was so confusing because Detroit, in my mother's childhood, was the richest city in the world in many ways. And by my childhood was a place of enormous suffering and chaos, and how that could come about and then sort of continue unrelenting through my childhood meant that the world seemed to me far less docile and predictable and smooth than it did to lots of other people. And so one of the reasons I actually think I was successful in finance to the extent that I was is that I was just as interested in how things go wrong as how they go right. And that actually used to be an American trait. It certainly is a longstanding intellectual trait, but it's not how most Americans and business people operate anymore. They read the biographies of the successful people. They don't read the biographies of the failures. They read about the wins, not about the losses. And that informed a lot of my thinking. And so finding out where in an institution, organization, a society risk lies is that most fundamental linchpin, is how do I find out who's got risk, who owns this risk? Because everybody else will say, that's not really my job.
That's so interesting. There's something also about climate in particular. My guess is that people that are responsible for risk are backward looking naturally in terms of assessing what forward risk can look like. That doesn't work as well when there is a perspective paradigm shift. How do you talk about that? How does that register with people?
It's actually especially hard for extremely successful people, because extremely successful people have experienced very few downturns. If you are the CEO at age 50, probably not much went wrong for you. And so your scope of imagination, even about what constitutes a bad outcome, is pretty limited. I mean, I vividly remember being in a small room where Hank Paulson said, climate change could be as bad as the 2008 financial crisis. And I was like, Hank, that is just like the worst thing that happened to you. And 2 years later, you were richer than you were then. Like, that is a real failure of imagination to think in those terms. And this is why the last 40 plus years were such bad training for this problem. So if climate change had been much worse in the 1950s or 1960s, society would have dealt very differently with it. Because thinking about risk was just part of civic life.
We've been talking in the abstract about climate risk, which is where I think a lot of people live. They get that there's going to be some sort of degradation of our environment in the seemingly distant future, and they look at it as being out 30 years, just beyond kind of their time horizon for concern. But you've spent a lot of time focused on breakpoints that are in the relative short term, that might act as wake-up calls. What are these risks, and why should we be concerned about them?
Yeah, and this gets back to your first question, which is why did I do this work, and why did I approach it in this way? Climate scientists have for decades been telling us about 2100. The year 2100 will be terrible. But they didn't tell us anything in between. And what I started asking scientists was, can we make available to people short-term implications of climate change on the duration of a mortgage, on the duration of, a simple bond, on the duration of an insurance contract? Can people make decisions that have a 1-year, 5-year, 10-year, 30-year time horizon? Nobody makes a 2100 decision, but people make decisions of other durations. And what's fascinating was that the science community didn't know how to do that or didn't know why to do that. So that's why we actually built Probable Futures, was as a bridge between climate science and community and civilization, essentially, society. And what we set out to do was get people in business, government, society to start asking questions. We're like, ask any question, we will go get you the answer. Ask something that might matter to you, we will go get you the answer. And build these bridges so that you had curiosity come from civil society and then expertise come from climate science. So we'll go back to that example of being in Deer Valley. So Deer Valley is in Utah next to Sundance, and it is at high altitude above Salt Lake City. Now, to the west of it is the rest of Utah, which is a desert naturally. But that desert has become super productive agriculture, and there are millions and millions of people who live there. And it really doesn't rain where they live. So how does that work? Well, society was built on snowmelt. That snow would reliably melt and run down as rivers and could be then harnessed to do all kinds of things. And so you built civilization in a desert. But if you change the winter temperatures in those mountains, even a little bit, you get way more volatility. All kinds of irrigation gets wonky, but also all kinds of flooding gets crazy. All these patterns. So it's already evident that that is underway in Utah. And so that's one. I think the second one, I would say, is that gets at why we didn't do risk so much, was we were able to outsource so many risk to risk experts. I had one friend in college who became an actuary. Wasn't sexy. Shout out to Freak if he's out there. He was a huge Santana fan and excellent at foosball, and somehow also wanted to be an actuary. But it just seemed so abstruse, like being an actuary. But actuaries counted the risks for us, and then those were codified into insurance programs and insurance prices. And when we just paid insurance, and we were told how much insurance would be, and we tried to get a cheaper deal from Jake at State Farm versus Flo at Progressive, but we didn't have our own assessment of risk. So risk was done by a small number of experts. What they didn't explain to us, what we didn't really internalize, is there's only insurance available for very specific kinds of risks. And those risks need to be unlikely. So like a 1% chance is very insurable. 5% chance, not really very insurable. Too high a likelihood. A decade ago, it became clear to me that Florida and California would start losing their insurance markets pretty soon. And that seemed outlandish at the time, but it also just seemed obvious to me and to climate scientists. And so we've already crossed that transom in lots of parts of the world where insurance is in retreat and doesn't function.
Are the markets working the way that they're supposed to be working at this point? Are we seeing the insurance companies retreat and that having an impact on property values and it's changing behavior?
So markets are interesting things, as you well know. I've had people in banks say to me, well, we can't just stop lending to this place. And I ask, well, but why? And they say, well, we have a whole division and we got all these people there and it diversifies our portfolio. And so there are forms of momentum and inertia. But you asked about insurance and whether it's working. Most people aren't aware of this, but so in addition to Florida, where insurance is retreating very actively, and California, where the same thing is happening, and some other coastal areas, there's also very difficult to get property casualty insurance and crop insurance in large stretches of the Midwest because the uncertainty about hail, the uncertainty about flooding is so great because much of that irrigation used to happen over time because the North, Canada, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, et cetera, would melt and send their water down those waterways gradually. And instead, you have these massive floods. And so there are other markets along the Midwest where just people aren't getting insurance. Is that translating yet? Well, the first thing it's translating into is demands by various parties to create an artificial insurance market. So if the insurance companies won't offer us insurance, who will? And in the case of Florida in particular, the state has built first an insurance company, then its own reinsurance company because the insurance company couldn't get reinsurance, and is quickly becoming the main insurer of the entire state. There is very little evidence that people are looking at this. Brokers don't want you to know this. The seller of the house doesn't want you to know this. The contractor, the developer, the town doesn't want you to know this. And so there's a lot of suppression of this risk information. And the second is insurance is only a one-year contract. If when you got a 30-year mortgage, you got a 30-year insurance plan, your 30-year insurance plan would now be astronomical in huge numbers of places, but you only see a one-year cost. But that's how it works.
What I hear you describing is essentially a huge buildup of risk in Florida, particularly around property insurance. And that risk is not being reflected in the markets yet because it's being subsidized because the states are coming in and providing a lower cost insurance. And there's some information suppression. But that's not a sustainable strategy. And while there are all these incentives for people to look the other way, particularly in the short term, at some point that's going to blow up. Or is it? I mean, is that the implication?
Yeah. I don't know what the blow up will look like. Will it happen in one day or will it happen in 5 years? And will it happen in a ramshackle fashion with people trying to stop it along the way with stopgaps? Maybe. One of the most interesting things about this is that there's increasingly accurate and specific economic research about who is buying these places. And it is clear that people who don't believe in climate change are buying riskier and riskier properties. That actually coastal communities are becoming more Republican, for example, is a demonstrated empirical fact.
I guess the question I have is that climate change science has been out there for a long time. And you've done a great job of demonstrating some of the economic implications of climate change. And it's pretty compelling. And yet that information doesn't seem to get adopted into action in the way that you might hope. Why is that? Why is it such a challenge to get people to look at the science of climate change and the economics of climate change?
It's the thing I think about the most. And what I come away with is a lot of sympathy for essentially everybody. Did you see the new movie Twisters?
I have not seen the new one.
The bad guy is a scientist who has a business, and that business pays people cash for their homes or land after their house has been destroyed by a tornado. Now, in the movie, that's portrayed as evil. No one else is immediately offering that family money. And it might not be right for that family to move back to that place or build that same structure. Maybe what makes more sense for their lives is to start their life anew somewhere else, go move in with family, go back to where they lived as children, do something else. But that choice set is so much harder than we're going to pretend